Have you ever woken up one day with the feeling that everything around you is exactly the same, yet somehow nothing feels the same anymore, as if life is still following its usual script, but something inside you shifted quietly, without warning, without a clear explanation? You look around, talk to the same people, follow the same routines, but there's a subtle sense of estrangement that's hard to put into words. Where does that come from? Maybe at first you tried to ignore that feeling. You told yourself it was just fatigue, stress, a rough phase. After all, it's easier to believe the problem is out there than to admit something inside you has started to move. But the discomfort doesn't go away. It shows up in the simplest moments, in the middle of a conversation that used to flow effortlessly, in a place that once felt comfortable, in an old dream that suddenly feels too small. It's as if the world is wearing the same clothes, but you no longer recognize yourself in them. And that's unsettling, because when something shifts inside, our first instinct is usually to try to go back, to feel again what we once felt, to force ourselves to fit into a shape that used to come naturally, but it doesn't work. And the more you try, the stranger everything feels. This kind of experience is often labeled a crisis, a midlife crisis, a crisis of purpose, faith, motivation. But what if it isn't an external crisis at all? What if it's an internal calling, a quiet invitation to see beyond the surface of things? That calling rarely comes with clear answers. Most of the time, it arrives as discomfort, as questions that refuse to stay silent. In the spiritual tradition, Jesus is often remembered not just as someone who spoke, but as someone who truly saw. He saw beyond appearances, beyond labels, beyond what seemed normal to everyone else. And maybe that's why his words were so unsettling, because once you begin to see more deeply, you can't pretend you didn't see. You can't keep living the same way. If you're feeling like something no longer fits, that doesn't mean weakness. It doesn't mean you're broken or lost. It may mean the exact opposite. It may be a sign that your perception is changing faster than your outer life can keep up. And that gap between what's shifting inside you and what still exists outside creates that strange emptiness, that restlessness that's hard to explain. Throughout this video, you'll gain a clearer understanding of what has changed, why it hurts more than it seems, and most importantly, what this phase is asking of you right now. You may discover that this discomfort isn't the end of something, but the beginning of a more honest way of being in the world. A way that isn't fully clear yet, but has already begun to announce itself within you. It's hard to pinpoint an exact day when everything started to change. For most people, there isn't a dramatic moment or a single event that serves as a clear turning point. Change tends to be quiet, almost discreet. It begins in small details, so ordinary they go unnoticed at first. A conversation that no longer excites you, a space that feels empty, even when it's full of people, an old dream that, for no obvious reason, loses its glow. You may have noticed it first in your relationships, people who have always been close, but now feel distant, not because they changed, but because something in you no longer connects the same way. The conversations continue, the laughter is still there, but there's a sense of superficiality that didn't bother you before. You start listening more than speaking, observing more than participating. And quietly, a question arises. Is this all there is? For others, this feeling shows up in work, in projects, in plans that once felt meaningful. What used to motivate you now feels repetitive. It's not exactly rejection, but it's not enthusiasm either. It's an uncomfortable middle ground where you realize you're walking a familiar path without real presence. And that brings guilt, because from the outside, everything looks fine. So why does this emptiness exist? Many people respond to this automatically by trying to become who they used to be. They repeat old habits, force enthusiasm, surround themselves with the same references, as if they could recover a former version of themselves. But this almost always fails. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because certain awakenings don't allow you to go back. Once something is clearly seen, pretending not to see it becomes exhausting. In the Bible, there are many moments where people walk the same paths they always have, but no longer recognize them in the same way. After an encounter, a revelation, an inner shift, what was familiar becomes strange. Not because the path changed, but because the one walking it is no longer the same. This is hard to accept, because it shakes our identity, our sense of belonging, our feeling of safety in knowing who we are. Jesus often caused discomfort for this very reason. He didn't bring comfort alone. He brought awareness. His words weren't just meant to ease pain, but to reveal truths people avoided facing. And when someone begins to see more deeply, an unavoidable side effect appears, an initial sense of solitude. Not necessarily physical loneliness, but the feeling of no longer fully fitting into the same spaces. This seeing too much doesn't feel like an advantage at first. On the contrary, it feels heavy. It creates distance. It makes you feel out of place, even in environments where you once felt at home. And that's when many people assume something has gone wrong, that they've lost the ability to feel joy, that they've become difficult, demanding, complicated, but maybe that's not it. Maybe you've simply started noticing what once slipped by unnoticed. It's common to look back and think this feeling came out of nowhere, but if you look closely, you might realize the signs were there for a long time. Small discomforts ignored, questions postponed, intuitions buried under routine. The difference now is that they're asking for attention. They can't be silenced by distraction anymore. This process doesn't happen because you failed to keep life the way it was. It happens because something in you matured. And maturing often means losing interest in what no longer makes sense, not out of contempt, but out of awareness. It's painful to realize that certain phases end without warning, that some versions of ourselves are left behind without a proper goodbye. As you hear this, you may start to realize that this feeling didn't really begin now. It just became louder recently, that the current discomfort is the result of a quiet accumulation of perceptions you avoided for a long time. And that realization can be frightening, but also liberating, because if it didn't start now, then maybe you're not behind. Maybe you're exactly where you needed to be to finally see. And this seeing, uncomfortable as it is the first step toward understanding why everything feels different today. When things start to feel different, the most common reaction is to look for an external cause. It's almost automatic. Work has become too heavy. People have changed. The routine feels suffocating. Society feels off. The world has lost its values. Somewhere outside of us, we believe something broke and needs fixing. That explanation brings a certain initial relief because it spares us from looking inward. Blaming the world is comfortable. It creates the sense that if something external changes, everything will fall back into place. If I change my environment, my relationship, my city, my routine, this feeling will disappear, and sometimes external changes do help. But the problem begins when, even after changing everything possible on the outside, the emptiness remains. The restlessness stays. The sense of estrangement doesn't go away. That's when deep frustration sets in. Because if the world was the problem, why didn't anything resolve? Why does the feeling of not belonging persist, even in new scenarios? This frustration often turns into emotional exhaustion. You start to feel like you're constantly trying to adjust something that never fully fits, chasing a familiar feeling that never quite returns. What almost no one teaches us is that often perception changes before reality does. Before your outer life transforms, something inside you has already begun to see differently. And when that happens, the same old world starts to feel insufficient. Not because it got worse, but because your inner lens changed. Without understanding this, you keep demanding answers from the world that it can't give. Philosophy and spirituality, when understood properly, don't appear as ready-made answers, but as new ways of seeing. They don't promise to fix the world, but help you understand why it affects you differently at certain stages of life. They aren't magic solutions. They are shifts in perception, and that's more challenging than it sounds, because it requires inner responsibility. In Christian spirituality, Jesus says something deeply unsettling when he teaches that the kingdom does not come in a visible way. He doesn't point to an external place, a system, or a structure you can observe from the outside. He points inward, to something that happens within a person before any external transformation. This idea is hard to accept because it goes against our instinct to look outward for what can only be recognized within. When we don't understand this process, we end up fighting life itself. Everything becomes a source of irritation. People feel shallow. Work feels meaningless. The world seems unjust or empty. And some of those perceptions may even be true. But the greatest suffering doesn't come from them alone. It comes from the expectation that the world should keep pace with the change that has already begun inside us. There's a delicate point here. Recognizing that the change is internal doesn't mean denying the real problems of the world. It simply means understanding that this discomfort won't be resolved through external adjustments alone. As long as you believe something out there needs to change for you to feel whole again, frustration will keep repeating itself, just in different settings. This is where many people give up. They get tired of trying to understand what's happening. They numb themselves. They go back to living on autopilot, or they convince themselves that this restlessness is a mistake, something to be eliminated at all costs. And that's precisely where the pain intensifies. Because this inner change doesn't hurt by accident. It hurts because it dismantles old structures, comfortable certainties, identities that no longer serve you. And in the next part, we'll talk about exactly that. Why this inner transformation hurts so much, why it feels like a burden instead of a relief at first, and why so many people stop right here without realizing they've already moved beyond the most superficial layer of the process. When perception begins to change, it's not as if everything inside you transforms all at once. The shifts are subtle, but profound. They don't make noise. They don't come with clear announcements. Most of the time, you only realize they're happening after they've already begun. The first sign is usually a change in values. What once felt important starts to lose its grip. Not out of disinterest, but out of a lack of meaning. You start to care less about appearance and more about substance, less about approval and more about truth. Things that were once tolerable begin to bother you. Small lies, superficial environments, empty conversations. Not because you've become better than others, but because your sensitivity has increased. And when sensitivity increases, what is shallow feels heavier. This shift brings a different emotional landscape. Emotions become more intense, more present. There's more empathy, but also more fatigue. You feel more. You absorb more. And at the same time, you lose patience with what feels artificial. This creates inner conflict because one part of you wants protection while another wants to stay open and aware. Another thing that changes is your relationship with silence. Before, silence might have felt uncomfortable. Now, it starts to feel necessary, not as an escape, but as a space for understanding. It's in silence that you notice what you truly feel, what you truly think, what truly matters. Without the constant noise of the world, certain truths become clearer even when they're hard to accept. Jesus, on many occasions, withdrew into silence, not to distance himself from people out of disdain, but to reconnect with what sustained his mission. Withdrawal wasn't a rejection of the world, but preparation to be in it more consciously. This simple act carries an important lesson. Understanding your own transformation requires pauses. When everything feels different, the impulse is to seek distraction, to fill every space with stimulation, to avoid discomfort. But it's precisely within that discomfort that change organizes itself internally. Awareness begins to expand. You start to notice inconsistencies between how you live and how you feel, between what you accept and what you truly believe. And once that awareness is there, it can't easily be undone. This phase doesn't call for immediate radical decisions. It calls for listening, for honesty with yourself, for time. The problem is that we live in a world that values quick answers, and this kind of transformation doesn't work that way. It unfolds at the pace of understanding, not urgency. If you're going through this, it's important to know there's nothing wrong with feeling confused. Confusion is a sign of inner reorganization. It's the space between who you were and who you're becoming. It doesn't demand judgment, only attention. And little by little, that attention begins to bring clarity. Every deep inner change carries a specific kind of pain. It's not visible, and it's not always explainable. It's a discomfort born of loss. Even when transformation is necessary, something old has to be left behind, and that creates grief. A quiet grief for versions of yourself that no longer exist. An old identity begins to dissolve. The way of thinking, reacting, fitting in. When it falls away, a void appears. And that void is frightening, because it hasn't yet been filled by something new. It's the space between who you were and who you're becoming. In that in-between, emotional loneliness often shows up strongly. You may be surrounded by people and still feel alone. Not because no one cares, but because few can follow this kind of inner change. Not everyone understands when you no longer resonate with the same things, when you step back, not out of rejection, but out of a need for inner coherence. This pain is often mistaken for failure, as if you chose the wrong path. But most of the time, it's simply the sign of a transition. Nothing is being destroyed without purpose. Something is being reorganized, and reorganization almost always hurts before it makes sense. The most important thing to understand is that this pain isn't the end of the process. It didn't come to break you, but to reposition you. There is meaning here, even if it's not clear yet. And in the next part, we'll talk about exactly what this experience is trying to teach you and how to move through this phase without losing yourself. When we go through this kind of transformation, it's natural to look for quick relief, something that makes the pain disappear fast, a simple answer that brings immediate comfort, but inner growth rarely works that way. It doesn't come to numb you. It comes to align you, and alignment almost always requires moving through discomfort we would rather avoid. This experience is teaching you that spiritual maturity isn't about feeling good all the time. It's not about constant peace or endless motivation. It's about learning to hold your truth even when others don't understand it yet. Jesus was never an example of escaping suffering. On the contrary, he taught presence, surrender, and coherence, even when that meant rejection and loneliness. There's a profound difference between changing to please the world and changing to be true to yourself. The first seeks external acceptance, the second seeks inner integrity. When you begin choosing the second, some things naturally fall away, not as punishment, but as consequence. And that hurts, because we were taught to measure our worth by the approval we receive. This phase asks for honesty. Simple but difficult questions. What have I been tolerating that no longer makes sense? Where am I betraying myself to avoid disappointing others? Which parts of me have I silenced in order to belong? These questions don't require immediate answers. They require presence. And slowly, they begin to reveal more aligned paths. You may be realizing that living on autopilot is no longer possible, that repeating old patterns creates deep exhaustion. That doesn't mean you need to break everything apart or make drastic decisions right now. It simply means something inside you is asking for truth. Even if that truth is still forming, if this content is touching something you've lived or are still living, it may be worth pausing for a moment to reflect. You can use the comments to share your experience. Sometimes, putting things into words helps organize what feels confusing inside. And if these reflections resonate with you, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this journey. The idea here is to walk together, without rush, without ready-made answers. This experience isn't asking for perfection, it's asking for presence. And that alone is already a profound lesson. If everything feels different now, maybe the problem was never you. Maybe nothing went wrong. What changed wasn't the world itself, but the way you began to see it. And when perception deepens, superficiality loses its appeal. That's not a loss of meaning, it's a shift in level. The world is still what it has always been, with its contradictions, its noise, its urgency. But you can no longer distract yourself in the same way. You're no longer satisfied with easy answers. You don't fit as effortlessly into spaces where you once belonged. That doesn't mean you're broken. It means something inside you has awakened. Jesus is often remembered as someone who walked through the same world as everyone else, but saw beyond appearances. He saw people where others saw labels. He saw processes where others saw failures. He saw meaning where others saw routine, and that way of seeing didn't distance him from reality. It made his presence more conscious. When you go through this awakening, there's a temptation to think you've lost something, that you've lost lightness, spontaneity, simplicity. But what's really lost is unconscious innocence. In its place, a deeper, quieter, more honest simplicity begins to emerge. It's still forming, which is why it feels fragile right now. There's nothing wrong with feeling out of place for a while. Every process of maturity passes through this stage. Discomfort isn't a sign of failure, but of transition. Over time, you begin to find new meanings, new ways of being, new connections that align more with who you're becoming. Maybe the question isn't, why did everything change, but what do I do now with what I've started to see? That question doesn't need an immediate answer. It can accompany you, guide you, keep you attentive. Sometimes, a good question is worth more than many answers. If this video resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who also feels like they're no longer the same. Sometimes, a reflection arrives at exactly the right moment for someone going through a quiet awakening. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, consider this an invitation to keep walking through these deeper conversations with calm and presence. Use the comments to share what you've been experiencing. Your story may help others feel less alone in this process. And remember, when things feel different, maybe you haven't lost yourself. Maybe you've just begun to truly see.